Probably most of you have been working hard all day. And I know it's always a slog coming to an event after court or after work, but the reason that the Inn has put this event on is because fair allocation of work is becoming an increasingly important issue, particularly in terms of retention of people at the bar. It's becoming one of the most important priorities for the Bar Council in retention. So we wanted really to start from square one and look at why, or what is fair allocation of work, and why should it matter to you, any of you? Just in summary, recruitment and work allocation, equality monitoring, is covered by Section 6 of the BSB Handbook, supporting information for chambers. There's no legal obligation on organisations other than particular public sector bodies to gather and analyse diversity data for the purposes of equality monitoring. And it's clear that equal opportunities policies in and of themselves on their own aren't necessarily going to bring about equality. The BSB guidance requires that chambers should each have a system for checking whether their policies are being carried out and whether they're working. And without equality monitoring data, which we're going to talk about at length in a little while, it's impossible to establish the nature or extent of any inequality. It's also impossible to identify the areas where action is most needed, and also whether any measures that are in place aimed at reducing inequality are actually working. To that end, at the latter end of 2020, the Bar Council introduced the first of a series of toolkits, Monitoring Work Distribution Toolkit, part one, which deals with sex, and it sets out very clearly that the clearest way to monitor how work is distributed is to analyse the distribution of income or receipts with reference to particular characteristics. And the first of these toolkits deals with sex, but there are others to come. And Elaine's going to talk a little bit about that in a while. The purpose of the rules in the BSB Handbook, Section 6, is simply to ensure that work is not unfairly allocated, and that people, barristers, but we are people too, are not refused employment because of protected characteristics. So we think there are two reasons, really, two key reasons why it's important. Firstly, you get the best person for the job, and all the diversity and equality implications of that. And secondly, of course, there's a risk analysis and compliance issue for chambers. So chambers need to make sure that their policies are in shape. So that's really the purpose behind tonight's seminar. And without any more ado, I'm going to hand over to Laura, who can do some introductions.
Thank you very much, Liz, and good evening, everyone. As Liz says, thank you for joining us. We appreciate some of your colleagues may not have been able to join today, and that may include clerks and staff. A recording is going to be made available of this session after the event, so please do feel free to share it around colleagues. And as I say, that does include staff, clerks, anybody else that might be responsible or touch upon fair allocation of work in your chambers, on your circuits, wherever that may be. And we've got three excellent speakers helping us answer questions tonight and helping Liz and I understand more about fair allocation of work. Introducing them in alphabetical order. First of all, we have Catherine Merry. She's the Civil Assistant Practice Manager at St Ives Chambers, which is a premier family law chambers on the Midlands circuit. She's previously specialised in family law before becoming a barrister's clerk in 2012, and she's been an assistant practice manager since 2015. Catherine, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about how it is that your role in Chambers touches upon fair allocation of work.
Yes, absolutely. Good evening, everyone. I am a member of Chambers Equality, Diversity and Wellbeing Committees, and I'm also Chambers Deputy Data Officer and Deputy Wellbeing Officer. So as part of that role, I have sort of quite a lot of involvement with the discussions about collection and monitoring and analysis of data surrounding allocation of work. For me, I think that allocation of work underpins the essential element of trust in a relationship between a barrister and their clerk. And when properly recorded and monitored, it can offer a valuable insight into the purposes of individual practice development and provide reassurance to members of chambers, and also a mark of quality to our professional clients.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Next, we have Elaine Banton from 7 Bedford Row. Elaine is a specialist employment equality and discrimination barrister of excellent standing. She's a member of the Bar Council's Equality and Diversity and Social Mobility Committee, which is where I became aware of her excellent work on fair allocation of work, and she's a member of the Bar Council's GMC. Again, Elaine, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about yourself and your involvement with fair allocation of work.
That's right. I actually became co-chair of the Equality, Diversity and Social Mobility Committee of the Bar Council in 2019. And I've had the pleasure of working on a working group with Rachel Crease, who's present tonight. I think I saw her name, which actually put forward the monitoring toolkit that you've referred to. So it's certainly something that falls within the remit of our committee. And I also hold similar responsibility in chambers and also at Middle Temple as well. Oh, should I say why? Well, I think it's incredibly important. I mean, following on from what was said earlier, the Bar Council's perspective is quite firmly that in terms of work allocation, fair distribution of work is one of the main factors that will help retention and progression at the bar of underrepresented groups and equality issues generally. So it's of fundamental importance, we say.
Thanks very much, Elaine. And last but by certainly no means least, we've got Fiona Fitzgerald, who is the Chief Executive at Radcliffe Chambers. Prior to joining Radcliffe Chambers, she was an equity partner at a top 200 law firm, and she served as chair of the Association of Women Solicitors. As well as that, she's a member of the Executive Committee of the Legal Practice Management Association and the Bar Council Legal Services Committee. So we hope between our speakers are all able to give different perspectives on fair allocation of work. But Fiona, could you tell us a little bit more about your involvement on a day-to-day basis with fair allocation of work and a bit more about yourself?
Yes, I mean, my job really is to oversee the strategy of Chambers and really to implement it. And part of that strategy is to ensure that we keep our barristers happy. And in order to keep our barristers happy, we need to ensure that they have a fair allocation of work. It's very, very simple. But the other side of that really is more of a business case. And the business case is that the more people are happy, the better profitable we are, the better people do. And so that's why it's fundamental to what we do and has been for a good number of years.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Fiona. Well, I'll hand back to Liz to pick up with the first question. And Liz, you're just on mute at the moment.
I had £1 for every time that's happened. Thanks, Laura. So the first question is for you, Elaine. What are the legal requirements about discrimination and protected characteristics as they apply to barristers and to chambers? And in particular, what are the other relevant concepts to be aware of in that are relevant to fair allocation of work, and what protected characteristics should be monitored?
Right. Well, a lot of people might not be aware, but the barristers as a group are actually covered by Section 47 of the Equality Act. So that means that the duty not to discriminate that we see in the BSB rules and code of conduct is really buttressed by the Equality Act. And so matters such of discrimination in terms of the protected characteristics that we're familiar with, race, sex, disability, sexual orientation, etc., apply to the bar and will apply in terms of work allocation. Many years ago, I was involved in in a big case that was brought by a barrister against a very successful set of chambers, and part of her case was about allocation of work. So this is something that is very important, as we say, in terms of fairness and equality, but also in terms of risk and compliance. So yes, in terms of the types of discrimination that apply, it's as we see in the Equality Act, so direct, indirect. Also, we have seen a lot of interest and really response from the bar over the past 18 months in terms of positive action. So that is where you can take positive steps which are proportionate to ameliorate disadvantaged groups in a nutshell. And so you can see schemes that chambers are doing, such as assisted and supported mini pupilages or mentorship schemes. Many chambers are actually doing schemes like this, where they are actively encouraging underrepresented groups to apply to schemes and then potentially assess them as a pupil, as a potential pupil candidate, etc. So there are many aspects in terms of the Equality Act that apply to the bar, and that works in tandem with the BSB rules as well. So in terms of monitoring protected characteristics, the Bar Council at the moment has focused on sex, because that is the biggest group where there is an issue. It still is clearly, obviously, the biggest group, and it's not a minority. It's really vitally important that that is improved on in terms of retention and progression. But potentially, we want to be in a position where all the protected characteristics can be monitored within chambers as well. Now, it's not the same approach. One size does not fit all. The monitoring toolkit doesn't present you with one type of allocation either, but it relies on statistics and averages, and that doesn't work for smaller groups. So for example, if you're looking at ethnicity, you're looking at race, you could have very small groups, and that will distort, to give you a distorted picture with averages. And so we need to have a different methodology. And the Bar Council at the moment is drilling down and devising the best way to actually put that forward. And it may be that we need to have a comparator group, and then you compare the individuals with that particular comparator group. But in terms of areas where you're going to have smaller numbers, such as you're like to have smaller numbers, such as race, disability, or sexual orientation, hopefully the next toolkit that's going to be produced will be far better equipped to deal with those smaller numbers in terms of monitoring of pay. So that's what I'd say on that for now.
Thank you very much, Elaine. And I think we'll come on shortly to ask you to talk about the new toolkit. Fiona, can you talk us through what the actual regulatory requirements are for fair allocation of work? And I think what we're really trying to understand here is practically what is it that chambers need to be doing?
Yeah, I think there's the regulatory aspect, but there's also good practice. Initially, what Chambers has to look at is right from day one to look at pupillage. So every year we are obliged to monitor the number of applications and through our various stages of the pupillage process, right the way through to the offer. And we have to analyse that broken down by race, disability and gender. The second part is we also have to regularly review, and this is once every 3 years currently actually, where we have to review all the barristers and staff. And on top of that, we also have to provide a method that the public can see that. Most chambers actually have this information on their website. And then the third aspect of what we're obliged to do is we are obliged to look at the allocation of unassigned work. Now, what is unassigned work? It's work that comes into chambers and it's not necessarily allocated to a particular person. So a solicitor will ring a chambers and say, I would like such and such a barrister. What will normally happen is they will ring and they will say, I would like a barrister between certain years of call or in a certain area or who's available tomorrow. So they're the three sides. What do those reviews mean? Well, really, we're looking at collecting and analysing that data. We're looking then at the reasons behind any of the disparity in the data, and then we should look at taking the appropriate remedial action. So that's really, there's two ways to look at this. There's the top down, and then there's the bottom up. So the top down is, we need to look at this as a whole, and we need to look at what remedial action we can take. But if you look at it from the bottom up, we should also be having these discussions on an individual basis with each barrister in relation to their opportunities, the conversion of those opportunities, why they didn't get those opportunities. And these are something that should be done on a regular basis. I believe actually normally practice meetings are taking place once every 6 months. Some chambers actually do it once a year, and other chambers are once every 3 months, depending on where you're up to.
So Fiona, when you're collecting monitoring data, how do you go about that task?
So it really starts from day one, and that is what we call opportunities. And that is when a solicitor calls to say, I would like to instruct somebody on this. And there are various methods of doing that. I would advise the best method is to use a case management system. And there are various case management systems that people use. Lex is probably the most popular one at the moment. I think it's something like 70% of the bar use Lex. And there are systems within Lex to allow you to gather that data. And really, that's the number one point. You have to do that as soon as it enters the clerk's room. And the information you're looking for there is, who's it come from, the sort of case it is, what are they looking for? And the point I'd make about that is it's really important that actually, if chambers do have case management systems, barristers are able to see those opportunities. And all the systems allow barristers to see those opportunities. So you can see on a daily, weekly basis, how many opportunities you've had, whether they have converted into a case, and why they didn't convert into a case. And the why they didn't is quite important, because you need to understand, is it because I wasn't available? Is it because my costs were incorrect? Or is it because they don't know me, or whatever those reasons are? And they're quite important to be able to have a discussion about at a practice meeting. And thereafter, we should be preparing and providing reports in relation to those opportunities. Many of the case management systems now can provide those reports, although it does need somebody to do a lot of manipulation of that. And that is to put that report of opportunities against our female barristers, our male barristers, against race, against ethnicity, all of these sorts of things, and then to look at where the issues are. And that's effectively kind of working from the bottom up. Then when we talk about working from the top down, we are looking at things like the monitoring toolkit. And that is looking overall at chambers and looking to see, are we providing this work correctly to a wide variety of people, or is it the same people who are getting the certain types of work? And the Bar Council prepared a fantastic toolkit which provides, I think it's 5 methodologies and different ways of looking at that. And we as a Chambers, I have to say, are actually using 3 of those methodologies at the moment, just to balance them against each other to see what is better for us. But this takes time, and it really means you really need to have somebody in a position who has all that information and who can look at that and then prepare a report so that it can be viewed by Equality and Diversity committees or by exec committees or whatever else it is.
Fantastic, thanks Fiona. Elaine, we'd like you to explain about whether monitoring should be anonymous, and if not, why not? But I was wondering if as part of this you could talk to us a bit more about the toolkit that you've been involved with from the Bar Council that obviously yourself and Fiona have referenced already. Perhaps we can help people to understand what's out there to assist them and their chambers in collecting this information and trying to put into place some of that best practice that Fiona's talked about. You're just on mute at the moment, Elaine.
Be done, hasn't it? It has to happen. I've seen in the chat that Clara's very helpfully put the Bar Council, they put the link to the toolkit, so anyone can access that. And I think, as Fiona's mentioned it already, as a practical tool, we think it's really helpful because it helps you frame the discussion in chambers as well. It gives you tips as to how you might deal with it, because as we know, not all chambers are the same. Some are more receptive, some are extremely open. For example, there are a handful of chambers that say 4 or 5 every month just have a spreadsheet with everybody's names and what they've earned, and it's shared. And that may be extraordinary to some, but that works in some chambers. Clearly, that doesn't work everywhere. And we do want to encourage people to look at this and look at fair allocation. So that's why we've come up with different methodologies. And I was really interested to hear that Fiona said that they've utilised a couple, 2 or 3 of them, to compare each other. I think that's a really interesting way to approach it. But I think you can see, if you look at the toolkit, there are some models which don't really give too much detail away, and that could be a starting point. Some are giving a bit more detail, but still without necessarily disclosing who individuals are. And then some, perhaps you might be able to guess some aspects, but generally speaking, you can do a lot. What the toolkit shows is that you can actually get a lot of information and compare a lot of data without giving away identity. And so it can be done anonymously, and I think that will encourage more people to do it. And also in some chambers it's held within various committees, so it's monitored, but it's just sort of dealt with by either equality or finance or a combination. So there's different ways of dealing with it, but it's really important that chambers do monitor it. They look at the work, the income, and also the types of work, because there's a pipe stream issue as well, isn't there? Because some people have exposure to particular types of big cases, or being led, that's an aspect, or also panel work is another area. So I think we have to have an eye to all of those different strands, really. And the work that we are doing, as I said, it's really Rachel Chris, who's actually watching tonight. She's been really leading that, and it's really important work, because as I flagged up earlier, it's quite clear that this really underpins who stays at the bar, who gets what work, underpins who stays at the bar long enough to become senior, to become in a leadership role or senior judiciary, and also take silk, etc. Those types of appointments. So it's crucial, if we really want to see equity and equality, that we tackle this and monitor this in a fair way. And so we will be aiming to bring out a second toolkit that will assist in other protected characteristics in the monitoring of that, because the same methodologies won't necessarily translate. We need to properly focus on how we can show any disparity or trends amongst groups where the numbers are smaller. In some chambers there could be 1 or 2 ethnic minorities, for example. So this kind of approach that we see in the sex toolkit will not translate that easily. So that's really what's happening there, and quite a lot of work is being done on that, I can say, at the Bar Council, and we think it's very, very important. And just to flag up one thing, there was a recent survey, the Bar Council response to a criminal legal aid review call for evidence, and there was a recent informal survey of 26 junior criminal barristers from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, and it said some have left the criminal bar already, others are actively trying to leave. All reported low rates of pay meant that they could not afford to stay. And women had even more entrenched issues. And then it also, I read that there's a report that in terms of being a QC represented a considerable uplift for both men and women, but it was £24,000 or thereabouts more lucrative for a man than a woman. So quite interesting trends that are being spotted in terms of income.
Blimey. Just staying with unassigned work, can I ask, first of all, Catherine, but then Fiona also, how in Chambers do you go about monitoring unassigned work? So the work that comes in for any barrister?
Absolutely. Technically, we actually treat unassigned work, i.e. that comes into Chambers without a name on it, as part of work allocation as a whole, because so it's actually easier for me to explain how we monitor work generally, because at St Ives it forms part of the bigger picture. We use a function within our case management system. Also, we use Lex bar squared, but we use Quality Mark. And how this works is that every time a new case is set up or a new barrister is added to an existing case, Quality Mark creates a record of the method and the criteria used to allocate the barrister to that case. Turning first to the distribution method, list sort of off the top of my head, it could be that that person was requested by a solicitor or recommended by the practice manager that they speak to, allocated by the practice manager, and that would be the bit that refers specifically to unassigned work, or where no preference is expressed by the person making the inquiry. Other possible categories would be if a QC requests a junior and vice versa. And then turning to the distribution criteria, which is sort of the secondary criteria, this would record additional data, for example, if the barrister was recommended or requested because of their particular specialism or experience, or as quite often happens, if they were already at court anyway. We run reports to monitor any trends, and more specifically Quality Mark report and also a BSB monitoring report. The Quality Mark report sets out how many cases have been allocated by each clerk, separated by distribution method and criteria. And you can tailor these reports to sort of drill down into the different categories, case types, funding types. And then the BSB monitoring report that we also use drills down further into the diversity data, race, disability, gender, and also shows the financial value of each case if the fees have been agreed or the case has already been billed.
Thanks. So Fiona, is it any different substantially in your chambers?
No, I think actually the initial process in the clerk's room is very much exactly the same. But there is a second side to that, and that is the individual discussion with the barristers. And that takes place at an individual practice meeting where we actually go through every single opportunity that has been put forward to that barrister, and we talk about them. And we allow the barrister to talk to us about, well, why didn't I get that? Or why didn't that come through? And we can go through those and explain them. And that's really important and has actually brought out some very worthwhile discussions about everything to do with pricing, to do with availability, to do with areas of work that they want to work on. And that's really important. And I would say that actually it's even more important from day one, following on from what Elaine said, particularly at our junior end, because in order for them to see that, and in order for them to have those opportunities to either be led, which I think most barristers would say the opportunity to be led is one of the best opportunities because it's the best learning opportunity for them. To ensure that everybody is led, we actually monitor all of our led opportunities as well, to ensure that every single junior has an opportunity at some point, and not necessarily just with one silk, with you know, a number of silks. And that's really important because then each of the individual barristers can understand what's coming in and where the work is going. And I think, you know, if you don't understand and if you can't see those opportunities, you always think somebody else is getting more than you or is doing better than you. So it's really important to be really open about it. But, you know, like Catherine said, that does start from day one. And, you know, I do know a number of chambers are not doing that. And if we can get anything from this and from today, I would just say, please can we monitor and just record every opportunity on day one.
Thanks very much. Laura, over to you.
I think everyone participating would agree that's been phenomenally informative already in terms of how the system works and understanding it from a number of different perspectives across the bar. What we'd like to get into now is a bit of a discussion about more about how this works in practice, and perhaps any thoughts for ways to improve or different challenges that might face different practice areas, for example. Catherine, you're in a chambers that does a number of different types of law. Do you think there's any kind of different approach that either happens or is needed when you're looking at fair allocation across different practice areas? For example, perhaps I'm an employment practitioner and lead work is extremely rare. I don't know if you've faced any differences between the different areas that are clerked in your chambers.
Yes, inevitably. I think one of the main, speaking for my own chambers, it very much depends on the size of the team involved. In theory, there could be a very large number of barristers available for a new case, for example, in our childcare team. So as to echo what Fiona said, it's very much about the conversation that you have at the initial inquiry point, so that you go into sufficient detail with the person that you're speaking to about the case, about the nature of it, who you're putting forward, and making sure that everyone's getting a fair shot.
Okay, and Elaine, when you've been working on this with Bar Council, I imagine you've looked at a number of different practice areas. Have you had any particular feedback about differences and perhaps maybe some areas of practice that are a bit further behind than others?
Well, yes, I mean, there are some, sorry, somebody talking? There are some areas, practice areas do make a difference. And so, for example, we can see in the criminal bar.
Sorry, just to interrupt you there, Elaine. If I could just ask everyone to make sure that they're on mute, or Clara, perhaps if you could just check. I think we've got it sorted. Thank you.
Thank you. I was slightly thrown by that. But yes, in terms of practice areas, we know that the publicly funded areas, for example, in family and crime, are less resilient than private areas of practice like commercial and chancery law. And we can see trends in that in terms of who becomes High Court judges and above, which are mostly drawn from the ranks of chancery and commercial practitioners. And you can also see that in some areas, some practice areas, there's more divergence between men and women and what they earn on average. Quite interestingly, so for example, in planning areas, there's actually quite a significant split, which may be considered surprising. But so yes, practice areas do come into it. And so you probably want to compare the different practice areas within different cohorts. So compare sort of like for like, as well as looking globally or more widely within a set of chambers.
Fiona, you're in what might be considered to be a chancery commercial chambers, and that might be me oversimplifying it. But is there any way when you're in a sort of a practice area with a small title like that, but that's all encompassing, that even other chambers can work together to see if there is best practice in fair allocation of work, or other organisations perhaps like the Chancery Bar Association?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the Chancery Bar Association have launched a report about a year ago, Voices of Women at the Chancery Bar, which is a fantastic report. It's quite a long one, I have to say, but really worthwhile a read. And through that, one of the big conversations for them were fair allocation of work. And in fact, there is a working group looking at that currently as to what they can implement to ensure that it is fairer across the board. So watch this space. I think it's coming up in a few weeks, actually.
Moving on to a slightly different topic, but with a similar sort of point, Fiona, are those sorts of organisations ones that can help with fair allocation of work across the country? Have you been aware of any differences between your set in London and chambers that are on circuit, and different challenges that might face them?
Yeah, I actually think, I think part of the problem is change can be fearful for everybody. And I think if you've been doing the job for a certain number of years, particularly in clerking teams or barristers who are getting involved in the monitoring, it's hard to change. And I think it's very important for organisations to get together to talk about it. And what I find actually is by having more conversations about this, I get emails following up saying, can we have a quick chat? Can we talk about what you're doing, what we're doing? Can we share best practice? And actually, we all learn from each other. You know, every time I do something, I always learn something from somebody else. So I think any and all organisations are incredibly useful, and we need to be open to talking about it, which is why today is very important.
Thank you.
I would say, though, I don't see a difference in regions as such. Where I really see the distinction is smaller sets. I think they really struggle with doing the monitoring of work because they don't always have the capacity to have full teams involved and people with the abilities sometimes or the time actually to do the work. So I think they're the ones who struggle more than the larger sets who have more professional setups.
And is that where you say, Fiona, it's about doing it as soon as the work comes in and capturing that data straight away? Does it need to be every clerk that's involved in this?
Absolutely. Different chambers, though, do different things. For some people, everybody has an obligation to do it. For others, in some sets, they ask the juniors to do it. But the one thing I'd say to you is, whatever case management system you're looking at, any of the barristers here, if you go and have a look at it, see whether you can see your own opportunities, because that will tell you what you can see and what you can monitor yourself. And then you can look to see how good your own chambers are doing with that.
Every other barrister like me just goes to their Lex page right now to work out how to do that. Catherine, you're in a Chambers on circuit. Where did you get your training from and your understanding about fair allocation of work?
Very much on the job, I have to be honest with you, just figuring it out as we go along. Fiona's very helpfully touched on what a marvellous tool opportunities is, and I absolutely 100% agree. However, I have to say, from a practical point of view, in our chambers, which is an extremely busy multidisciplinary set, on a day-to-day basis, it is extremely time consuming. And so there are differing views as to how practical it is to apply to every single inquiry that comes in.
And Elaine, in your work sort of coming up with the toolkits and overseeing some of these areas, have you noticed any differences between London and the circuits in terms of uptake, understanding, or again, different challenges that might be faced?
I haven't got the detail on that, and that's quite interesting. There may be some areas some difference in terms of regional areas. I'm not sure if Rachel Crease might be aware of that. She might put something in the chat, because I know that she's spoken on this topic at various places, so she might be aware of that anecdotally, and I'm not sure if we've got any sort of collective data on that yet. So it might be anecdotal, but I could well imagine that there are some differences, and you'll find pockets of excellence in, all over. I mean, it just depends on individuals really engaging with this issue and pushing for it to get done. Really, that's what it takes. So yeah.
Well, and I think that's what's so helpful to hear this evening is the reasons why this is important to everybody, and it's not just a women's issue or an ethnic minority issue. That actually, as you say, if it means that the best people become the judges, and I think Rachel's been very helpful in the chat there about how this is one of the most important things about retention at the bar, as you said, Elaine, which we all know is a huge problem. How about this then? Fiona, as you've gone through this process, what have you learned along the way that you think you wish you'd known at the outset? As you say, the sort of best practice that if maybe someone's not quite as skilled in this area as they are in your chambers, what would you want them to know now that you've had to go through the difficult time to learn?
As Catherine said, it is time consuming, but actually there is a time saving in there as well at the same time. And it's about putting in a process, and putting in changes like this are very difficult. So it's sort of firstly looking at a cultural shift within chambers in terms of how you implement it and how you can work out the workflow. I mean, I'm very much about the process and putting a workflow in place and looking at the time it takes to get everything done. And then it's about training and auditing. So, getting involved and having a look to see, are we doing it? Are we doing it well? monitoring how much we're looking at these opportunities, and if we're not, doing some more training. And then it's about talking to the barristers and doing some training with the barristers. We've recently actually just done a full training session with all of our barristers in how to use our case management system, and what information is available. And really, you know, most people have case management systems available, but, you know, there was a survey done, I think it was Harvard Business Review a few years back. And one of the things that came out of it was that all these systems are fantastic, but the vast majority of people only use about 20% of them. So, you know, and we're never going to get to 100%, but if we can give people the tools to actually have a look for themselves, or to even have somebody to run a report for them, then I think that would be a very helpful way for everyone to start taking back some control. And that's quite important, I think, for people to feel that they're in control of their own practice. And this is a great method of doing so.
Well, I think this touches upon a question that's been asked in the chat by Simon Golston. He's asked about whether there should be a system implemented in Chambers where every member has visibility of every inquiry and where it was allocated. Is it the case that at the moment you ought to be able to use the systems to see what inquiries came in that could have been allocated to you? Or is it, as you say, in terms of or I think it was Elaine mentioning, potentially everybody seeing each other's earnings? Should we all be seeing each other's inquiries and where they've gone?
Shall I answer that, Laura?
If you wouldn't mind, Fiona, yes, please.
Okay. So in our chambers, no, everybody does not see everyone else's opportunities, because there's a confidentiality aspect to that. And occasionally there's, you know, we have to have Chinese walls. On some occasions, we have a member of Chambers who is a mediator or a judge on a case, and somebody else is, you know, we can have cases where we have somebody on either side. So no, everybody can only see their own opportunities. But what's quite important is they can ask questions about those. You know, what happened to that case? I saw a case came in from such a person. What happened to that? How come that didn't turn into a case? And that's just on the individual basis. We talked about as well at the same time having the top down, and that's the overall piece. And we can't list every opportunity, but what we do is we talk about what percentage of work went to what barrister, what the value of that was, how many of those cases went to them, and we break it down by a number of different areas.
Okay. Catherine, have you got any top tips that you've learned along the way, perhaps in terms of it being time consuming, any ways that have helped you that you'd want to share with other clerks?
I think all that I could say is that it's not one size fits all, and you need to think very carefully about the criteria that you are recording. In fact, we are partway through the process of reviewing the criteria that we use. So our diversity committee is actually working on a report and an action plan for how to review those criteria, making sure that we are recording the right information and what are we missing out on, and trying to identify that. But again, I can only echo what Fiona said about keeping an open dialogue. I think that's the most important thing between the clerks and members about allocation of work, and making sure that there are discussions about the work that they receive and also the work that they don't receive, as she said.
Now, there's some of the positives. Elaine, is there any particular bad practice that you've become aware of, and any tips that you might want to give to people on this seminar as to how they might try and combat some of that bad practice?
Well, you hear, you know, being involved in Bar Council and having trained for many years as well, you hear different stories that the individuals share from different sets in their experiences, where, you know, work is allocated in terms of sets. And that certainly is a factor. We also know that there are issues around panels, like I mentioned before, such as you know, CPS, Attorney General's panels, that sort of thing. So we know there's a lot of work to do, but I do think the key area is to discuss it in chambers, to get people on board as to why it's going to actually help chambers to flourish, for individuals to reach their full potential, for it to be more profitable, as well as being more equitable and more fair. So it's really a win-win situation all round. So I think it's the starting point is to have that discussion, get people on board, and then find a methodology that works within Chambers and monitor it. So it's really important.
Fiona, you've mentioned that people get in touch with you with queries after you've been at events. Have you got any extra points you might like to add about how we can try and challenge any bad practice that is ongoing in someone's chambers, for example?
Yeah, I think it's really important not to have a blame culture. I mean, everybody's doing their best and they're working hard, and I think we have to try and work together to find solutions. So it's sometimes it's really about asking the right question, and you know, part of today's session is really knowing the question to ask, isn't it? And so if we can ask the right question about, you know, what is happening with our opportunities, how are we monitoring this? I understand that it is part of our obligations at barristers. These are all things that can get chambers talking about it and looking at methods that work for them.
Okay. Catherine, in terms of the future and your involvement with fair allocation of work, have you got any ideas of where you would like to see this go, how you would like to see it develop or progress?
Yes. Within our chambers, rather than E&D all being dealt with as lumped into one committee, we have separate subcommittees that deal with each area separately so that we can focus more closely on any issues. And obviously fair allocation of work is the largest issue that we're dealing with at the moment on our diversity committee. Can I circle back a little bit to some of the bad practice issues, because I did have a couple of things to share on there. The first thing that I wanted to talk about from a clerking perspective is obviously one of the pitfalls, I think, is some people may mistakenly view monitoring as a tick box exercise and that it's just data that sits on a spreadsheet somewhere that nobody looks at. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is the worry that some clerks may have that someone is second guessing or criticising their decision-making process, when in fact monitoring, I consider, is actually quite the opposite. Most clerks are so busy that they can't possibly be expected to remember the minutiae of every single telephone call or inquiry that they deal with. So accurately recording the method of the allocation is really the insurance policy that we hope we will never need. It's really important to remember that monitoring is not really there to catch anyone out, and it's there to help individual barristers in their practices and the practice groups within chambers and chambers as a whole. The other thing that I wanted to say from a barrister, and possibly sort of speculating on why some barristers may feel that it's not something that is important or relates to them. It's my view that our professional clients care about the ethos of those that they do business with, and that championing equality and diversity generally and fair allocation of work specifically forms a large part of this. And the other final thing that I did want to mention, and I will let you move on, is the diversity questionnaire. And I would encourage all barristers to give real consideration to completing the questionnaire when it comes round, if they feel comfortable doing so. I do feel personally that a practice area and chambers as a whole can only work with the information that it has, and to identify trends, both positive and negative in work allocation, is only possible if they have as much diversity data as possible available.
Catherine, I wouldn't rush you through any of those points at all. They were really helpful, and I think real positives to hear and for us to be able to feed back into our own clerking rooms.
Thank you.
In terms of the progress, and I think it's helpful to understand about how we can help with the diversity monitoring and data. Elaine, you've obviously talked about the toolkits that will be coming out from the Bar Council in future for different protected characteristics. What are the ways in which would you like to see fair allocation of work develop, and what might those of us that are keen for progress keep in mind to help drive it forward?
Well, yes, I mean, I think we want to see it taken up by all chambers, really. What we want to do is to ensure that all the standards are raised. So whereas we know there's an obligation, a responsibility in terms of regulatory to monitor unassigned work, we want it to be monitored for all work and not just on gender, race and disability, but also other protected characteristics as well. So we really want to see it being taken up. depending on the size of chambers, that's going to be a factor as well as to how it's done. And I know that there's a comment in the chat from Rachel about that, in terms of some sets who are small and have less capacity, and others, bigger sets that have more resources and able to really get into this and drill down into it. But I think it's a process that we really want to see happen across the board. It is so crucially important for everything that we're working for in terms of equality and diversity, and having a strong bar reflective of all the rich, diverse talent in society. It is absolutely fundamental. And so, you know, in terms, as we said, in terms of retention and progression, it cannot really be emphasized enough that this is one of the most key factors there is to make a difference. And there's very little against it once you explain the realities to individuals. There might be some confusion or resistance, but once it's explained, I really think there's a good buy-in, and we'd like to see that. I think the Bar Council would like to see it being applied regularly across all chambers at the bar.
I think that's a really helpful headline for all the points that the three of you have been able to convey about why, as we say, this isn't just an EDI tick box, but why it actually benefits everybody. Fiona, any ways in which you'd like to see it perhaps refined or widened or progressed in a different direction?
Well, a couple of things really. Firstly, currently we only have to do the equality and diversity monitoring once every 3 years, and I'm not sure that that's often enough. I actually think it should be once every year. And I think, you know, certainly it's something we've been thinking about as to whether to increase that and to do it once a year as a matter of course, because really it's very hard to actually do this monitoring correctly and properly when you have so many changes. You've got, you know, if you're taking on 2 pupils a year, that's 6 new pupils over 3 years. You know, your silks may change and whatever else. So that would be my first thing. My second thing is we actually look at it more widely than just the unallocated work. Because actually, and following on Catherine's point, I've had a number of conversations over the summer with partners in law firms, mainly city law firms, I have to say, who feel very strongly that they want clerks to put forward a balanced portfolio of barristers. It's something that actually is very important. And so we're not looking just at the unallocated work, but at the allocated work as well. Because sometimes there can be a blending of that information that you can't always assess something as allocated or unallocated. So that would be the second point. And the third point is I think in terms of best practice is to have those sorts of discussions openly about making sure we are putting forward a portfolio of people on each and every case and looking and checking, you know, and I think that would make a massive difference actually.
Great, thank you very much. Well, Liz, if I can hand back to you for a concluding question from our questions for the panel, and then we'll move on to some of the audience questions.
I have 2 questions actually. One is I wanted to pick up on that point about allocated work, or work that comes in for somebody in their own name, or as often happens, somebody's at court, they do a good job of chatting to an opposing solicitor, let's say, or somebody who's on the same case, and they pick up the work that way. What implications are there for that sort of what I call self-clerking in terms of the monitoring? So that's my first question. So that's probably to all 3 of you, really. I don't know, Catherine, do you want to start?
Oh, we do love a bit of self-clerking. Obviously, it's wonderful that barristers are at court or in whatever arena they are, making connections, building relationships, and that's what we absolutely encourage everyone to do. I think the slight pitfall there is that not everyone, particularly in a post-COVID environment, has the opportunity to be present at court, chatting with people, making those connections. People have different commitments and obligations in their life that mean they might not be available for networking events or speaking engagements or whatever it happens to be. And I suppose that's where effective clerking is more important than ever, really, to ensure that, yes, it's great that people are selling themselves into work, but sometimes that person might not be available. So if I was having a conversation with a solicitor in those circumstances that said, Miss X really impressed me at court, I'd very much like to instruct them for this case. Well, that's great, and they're available. But if they're not available, who else is available? And let's talk about the other members of the team as well, and making sure that there's a more detailed conversation there about other options. I suppose that's all I would say there, really.
Anybody else? Fiona, have you got anything to add?
I think self-clerking is fantastic. I think it's fantastic if barristers have those relationships, and I see it quite a lot, actually. A solicitor will email somebody and say, can I just have a quick word about a case or whatever else, and it can lead on to something else. It's just important that that is then pushed to the clerks as well, so that they can make sure that all the compliance side of things is done correctly. Following on from Catherine, I'm slightly moving away from this, but I actually think it's equally as important, is the allocating of marketing opportunities, is to ensure that actually everybody in Chambers is getting equal opportunities to market our business development or introductions to clients. And that isn't always about the work itself. Sometimes it's about a team, or a law firm might ask for a team of people to go and see them or to have drinks, making sure that we have cross sections of people who go out, because that's actually, that comes before those opportunities in many respects. So we've got to get that whole process right.
And Elaine, I just was quite interested in following up from what Catherine said about that in terms of networking. I know historically for myself, being a parent and being older, when I came to the bar, I wasn't as able to go to the pub, or I tried, but I wasn't as able to go and do perhaps some of those more traditional things, particularly when I was doing a criminal pupillage. How does that sort of networking side of things and the self-clerking fit into this new model?
Well, it's quite interesting. Oh, yes. Oh, I am unmuted.
Yes.
Oh, there, caught myself out. It's quite interesting. I'm really glad that Fiona brought up the issue of marketing opportunities and networking, because there is a degree of the bar having a culture of procuring a type of self-generated work, which tends to favours some rather than others. And so I do think we do need to be conscious of this. We need to be really cognizant and to monitor marketing opportunities as well, so that we can see who's getting introductions, who's writing articles, who's meeting up with solicitors. And so it's not always only about going to the pub for a drink after work, because not everyone can do that all the time. Clearly, it doesn't fit everyone. That's a particular culture. So I think that's really important too. And absolutely, I think monitoring of that is important. Another thing that has been flagged up to me, and it's something that we do know in terms of access to the bar as well, and particularly the junior years, that mentorship is really important. But also not to forget that mentorship of more senior and mid-ranking barristers, middle, is also really important too. And that can be done within chambers, within certain groups, or externally. I just think we need to be more creative about how we potentially help and assist others to reach their full potential.
That's really helpful, thank you. The second question I had is sort of linked to that, really, which is about how you bring about the cultural shift. And it strikes me that this is probably all reasonably recent. I'm thinking about probably the last decade. Maybe I've picked up wrongly on that, but it feels like the ball's really sort of picked up. And I suppose I'm quite interested in ideas about how you start bringing about cultural shift. Does it, for example, is it better to start with the individual relationship between barrister and clerk? Is it better that the clerking team per se really is embedded in it? or is it better to start with a whole chambers approach, a whole membership approach? So Fiona, I'm quite interested to hear how you, I don't know if you were responsible for initiating it in your chambers, but how has it worked incrementally, do you think, in your chambers?
Yeah, I joined Chambers 7 years ago from a law firm background. What surprised me most was how we didn't talk about things, actually. And we weren't so open about things, but I think that was across most chambers, actually. And that culture has changed quite a lot. I think there's a number of things that can happen. So firstly, there's the regulatory side of things. And the Bar Standards Board released what they called a regulatory return last year. And they asked all chambers to complete that and have it in, I think it was by early this year. And within that, actually, there were questions about fair allocation of work. And that's really important because by asking those questions, it helps kickstart that conversation. The second thing that kickstarts the conversation is our clients. If our clients are saying to us, you know, we want to see more people put forward. We don't know your juniors, or we don't know your female silks, or we don't know your ethnic minority barristers. That's incredibly helpful because once again, it means we have to do something about it. So that's really important. And actually, it's interesting. One of the conversations I had most recently about this area, there were a number of law firms there, and they came to me afterwards and said, well, a couple of them came to me afterwards and said, what can we do to help? And we had conversations about this, and actually it's a fantastic business development opportunity. There's a real business case here, because actually we've been going out to those firms and say, let me introduce you to a wider selection of people, and we'd really like to get to know your team, and you can get to know our people as well. And that's been incredibly helpful to kickstart this process. I think the second thing is you need leadership around this. You definitely need somebody to take hold of this and implement it. And it's not easy. It's not easy to get change across that line. So you need, whether it's a barrister, whether it's a member of staff, whoever it is, you need somebody to take ownership and to make sure it's implemented. And the third thing I would say is we need to talk to each other. We need to learn from each other what our systems are capable of, what works for us as a chambers. And then we just need to keep having those conversations, because the more we talk about it and the more we use these tools that we have, the more it becomes embedded within. And it does. But it does take time, and it's never 100%. But if we can get it to 95 or 99%, then it's a lot better than zero.
Thank you, Catherine. From a clerking perspective, where do you think it's best to dive in?
Absolutely, in the relationship between the barrister and the clerk, and that starts from day one of pupillage. Barristers need to know and to be reassured that there are lots of different ways that they can form and maintain working relationships. And that doesn't just mean going for drinks. There are lots of different things that can help to form those relationships and develop good work. So I think it does start with the barrister and the clerk.
Elaine, anything to add to that?
I would echo everything that's been said. It's a whole chambers thing. Barristers and clerks from the top down, from the bottom up, culture change. You need an awareness and you need intention. And whatever you can do to maximize those two things will mean that you will get your culture change, and it will be embedded throughout every system in chambers, which is what you really need to have culture change.
Thank you. So if I wrap up now with our final question for you all, and then we'll just look and see what's come up in the chat. So going in, I'm trying to think about reverse alphabetical order, but that's too complicated for my brain at this time of night. So I'm going to start with the first person who's first on my screen, Elaine. Having spent the last hour discussing fair allocation of work and thinking about it from all different perspectives, are you able to sum up really why you think it matters to everybody at the bar, just in a few words?
Yeah, I think it goes to the heart of fairness and equality, and so that and to maximise potential and thriving at the bar. And I think as fundamentally as advocates who uphold the rule of law, we also understand about equality and equity, and it should apply to us too, as well as our clients. So I think for so many reasons, it's a really vitally important thing.
Thank you. Catherine, you're next.
Hello. I would say that for me, I think it very much helps with retention of barristers of all types, and ensures growth in all areas. It ensures that the best person for the job is available each and every time, and that can only help to maintain and strengthen professional relationships, Chambers' reputation, and indeed the reputation of the bar itself.
And last but not least, Fiona.
Two things really. One, it's the right thing to do. But secondly, you know, I come back to the point I made earlier, the business case is there. Financially, it makes sense to do that. It makes sense to ensure that all of our barristers are doing their best and are their best. And I certainly see that as part of my job, to help each of my members to be the best that they can be. And part of that is having the right type of work, enough work, challenging work, sometimes easy work if we want an easier day, but that's really important. And it seems to me if we get both sides of that right, then not only will Chambers be successful, everybody will share in that success, and whether that is reduced contributions, higher salaries, whatever those things are, it means that everybody shares that.
That's great. Thank you all very much indeed. So I think, Laura, over to you for just looking at any questions that have arisen.
Yes, we've had a couple of questions in the chat which I think have been answered already, and one which I'll pick up on, and then we had a few questions sent in advance. If anyone has any questions still arising that you'd like to put in the chat, please do, and I'll try and pick up on those. So one point that I think hasn't been quite answered from the chat already is from Yardankwa Ampadu Saki, who's asked a couple of questions about the toolkits that have been mentioned and whether they're essential and whether there ought to be spot checks to make sure that Chambers are using them. It strikes me that this is a comment you made before, Elaine, about, well, why wouldn't you? Can you really see any good reason why a chamber shouldn't be at least starting with the Bar Council toolkits that have been created?
No, I can't see why they shouldn't start. There's something in there for everyone, from the most basic analysis to some of the more sophisticated models there. But it's absolutely right. I absolutely agree, you know, with Yardankwa, what she's saying, that we should really be encouraging all, and that is what the Bar Council is doing by putting it out there, by sharing the information and giving Chambers a methodology or a structure to go about actually monitoring allocation of work across the board, in terms of, at least with this one, the first one is gender, comparing gender, but as we say, others are in the pipeline, so we think everybody should be doing it.
Fiona and Catherine, I'll come to you each in turn, but you're obviously very familiar with what's required for fair allocation of work. Have you found any reason to deviate from what you're aware of as being in the toolkit? Catherine, how about you?
No, not at all. It's set out perfectly clearly, is extremely helpful, and no, I can't think of any reason why you would want to deviate.
Fiona, any different view?
Well, before the toolkit was issued, we were actually looking at things quite differently. I know the Bar Council are working on other toolkits at the moment, but for us, we're looking at it across a number of areas. We're not just working on the gender side. So we are using it, but we are looking at wider areas, which no doubt the Bar Council will provide further information on in due course. But, you know, for us, there are certain other issues that we're working on and that we're aware of. So, and I think every chambers will have their own issues that they need to be aware of, that they will pick up from their own monitoring.
Okay, and here's a practical question that was sent to us in advance anonymously. It was asked, although the burden should not rest solely with the victims of unfair allocation of work, what steps could those individuals take to ensure fair treatment? Perhaps where meetings with clerks and senior staff have not led to improvements and a complaint to head of chambers has been ignored. How might a member go about challenging that sort of situation? What would you think, Fiona, from being at the top of the organisation where you are?
So I think every organisation is different, and I don't always feel that challenging works. I think you have to start with helping people to provide solutions. So I think if you look at it from an individual point of view, it's about asking the question, and that is, you start in the practice meeting. And you ask the question, you know, how many opportunities have I had? Why have I got those opportunities? Why did they not convert, etc.? And you take it from there. You can work alongside that, perhaps if there's an equality and diversity committee, to say, did you know we need to be monitoring this? And then work in tandem alongside that. So I think that's what individuals could do. But ultimately, I suppose, if it's not working, then that's a completely different challenge, and you need to consider if that is the right chambers for you, I suppose, because you can only give people the tools to make those changes, and keep trying, but there comes a point where perhaps it's not going to work.
Elaine, might you have any tips for someone in that kind of difficult situation?
Yes, it's quite, I think on a practical level, it can be really helpful to find an ally in chambers that you trust, who you can talk to confidentially, and that could be someone who's on the, potentially could be on the E&D committee or an EDO. Chambers are meant to have EDOs, so there should be someone there that you could approach. But also, if you're looking for more support, because as we know, not all chambers are the same, not all are receptive, the Bar Council's Equality Helpline is there. It's open to anyone, barristers, clerks, etc., who want to have discussions confidentially about these issues. They can give you practical advice and support. And so in the chat, we've got the email and the telephone number. And I know that some of these issues that are raised are dealt with individually at the Bar Council. Sometimes they land on myself as well, and I've been involved. And so there is quite a lot of support there to help get things on track, to be improved where they can be improved. So yes, I think there is practical ways forward, but you know, as Fiona said, if it's too entrenched and too difficult, then there may be you know, it may be another solution. But I think with some goodwill and assistance, a lot of these situations can be improved.
And Catherine, is there anything you would add to that?
No, all that I can do is echo Fiona and Elaine's comments, absolutely. And yes, just to hope that perhaps with a bit of open communication, it might be possible to resolve the issues. That would be my hope if somebody came to me with that kind of a concern.
And I'm not suggesting our talk this evening will solve those sorts of entrenched problems, but I think it has been phenomenally helpful how you all have been able to convey not only the system, but the benefits to everybody at the bar of this system. And as we've said, the recording will be made available. I recognise a number of names of attendees, and they're people who I'm very glad to see here, but some of whom I'm not surprised to see listening in on a Wednesday evening to an equality and diversity talk. And I've had people get in touch with me and ask what's an easy way to get some CPD before the end of the year. Well, this is a way that we can now tell them will help to benefit their own practice as well as chambers as a whole. If they just want to listen along to the hour and 20 minutes, I think we might be by the end of the recording that Clara's told us, the recording and the transcript are going to be made available on the INS website and on the news and media section. And I think it's fair to say, isn't it, as Liz highlighted, we are moving in this direction, and as it becomes more normalised, hopefully the anonymous question poser here won't face these sorts of issues in future. Now, I think we've probably covered all of the other questions that we properly can under this heading that have been posed in advance. We've not seen any extra ones come in the chat function. So we'll go for a slightly early finish. But if I could just thank our panel very much for all the input that they've given this evening, all the time they've given in preparation, and also to Rachel Chris, who I believe is a consultant with the Bar Council for Equality and Diversity Matters, who's been phenomenally helpful in the chat in pointing people in the right direction and answering questions on data and systems and the like. I will ask Clara if she can put those contact details on the website along with the recording and the transcript for anybody that might want to look for further information in future. But Liz, unless you have any further concluding remarks, just again, thank you very much to our three excellent panel members.
Absolutely, just want to echo everything you've just said, Laura. Thank you so much to all three of you. I've certainly learned loads, and it just shows you're never too old or senior to learn. So thank you all.